Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 1, an historicist commentary on the Revelation, updated and revised for the 21st century, derived from the original work of E.B. Elliott, updated, revised, and read by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur. Preliminary Essays. Essay 2. The Date of the Apocalypse. This is my second preliminary point of inquiry, and one on which also, I believe, the historical evidence will be found not only ready at hand, but conclusive. For the testimony of Irenaeus, Polycarp's disciple, let it be again remembered, who was himself the disciple of the Apostle John. It is expressed to the point in question as it is unexceptional. Speaking of the name and number of the beast in the Apocalypse, he says that had this been a matter then to be made known, it would have been disclosed by him who saw the Apocalypse. For it, the Apocalypse, was seen no very long time ago, but almost in our age, toward the end of the reign of Domitian. The attempts that have been made to get rid of this testimony and force another meaning on Irenaeus' words by those whose apocalyptic theories made them wish to do so seem to me to have utterly failed. It is as clear a testimony on the point it relates to as there can be found to any other fact or any other historian. Nor is it unsupported by other testimony. First, Tertullian seems in no dubious manner to indicate this view of the apocalyptic date, for in his Apology, after specifying Nero's as the first imperial persecution, and this one by the sword, wherein, as he elsewhere says, Paul and Peter suffered, no mention being made of John, he proceeds to notice Domitian as the next persecution, and this as one in which Christians suffered by banishment, the well-known punishment inflicted upon St. John. It is evident that Eusebius thus understands Tertullian, as alluding to St. John's banishment as the act of Domitian. Next, Clement of Alexandria, indirectly, but I think clearly, confirms the statement. In relating the well-known story of St. John and the robber, he speaks of it as acted out by the apostle on his return from exile in Patmos after the death of the tyrant, and represents him as, at that time, an infirm old man. Now, the tyrant whose death is referred to must necessarily either be Nero or Domitian, as these were, up to the end of the first century, the only imperial persecutors of the Christian body. And Nero it can scarcely be, since, at the time of Nero's persecution, St. John was by no means an infirm old man, being probably not much above, if indeed so much as, 60 years of age. Thus it must have been the tyrant Domitian. So in fact Eusebius expressly explains Clement to mean. Nor is there anything whatsoever inconsistent with this view of the chronology of the story, so as some have supposed, in Chrysostom's second-hand version of it, but the contrary. Thirdly, Victorinus, bishop of Pt4 and martyr in Diocletian's persecution, in a commentary on the Apocalypse written toward the close of the 3rd century, says twice over expressly, and in a part that bears no mark of interpolation, that the Apocalypse was seen by the Apostle John in the Isle of Patmos when banished thither by the Roman Emperor Domitian, to the same effect. Fourthly is a very important testimony of Eusebius. For though doubting about the author of the apocalyptic book, and in these doubts we see exemplified the free exercise of his independent judgment, yet on the date of St. John's banishment to Patmos, he distinctly intimates more than once his agreement with the tradition of the ancients that referred it to Domitian's persecution. and indeed implies, as is perfectly evident, that he knew of no other tradition whatsoever as to the time of St. John's banishment to Patmos. The same is the recorded judgment of Jerome, the same of Augustine's friend Orosius, the same also of Sulpicius Severus. Once more we find an unhesitating statement of similar purport in Primatius, an eminent Augustinian commentator on the Apocalypse of the 6th century. In his preface to his commentary, he speaks of the apocalyptic visions having been seen by St. John when banished and condemned to the mines in Patmos by the Emperor Domitian. Other ancient testimonies of less importance might also be added, such as the later and subsidiary patristic testimony still extant to the fact of St. John having seen the apocalyptic visions in Patmos under the reign of Domitian, a chain of testimony not to be viewed as but simply the repetition of that of Irenaeus, whom indeed, for the most part, these writers do not even refer to, but as their own deliberate independent judgment, formed on all the evidence which then existed. As to any contrary early tradition respecting the date, if such there was, it can scarcely have been unknown to them, and our total silence respecting it is only explicable on one of two suppositions, vis-a-vis, either that it did not exist, or that they deemed it undeserving of credit, and not even worth the notice. Nor can this be wondered at, seeing that as to any contrary statement on the point in question, there appears to have been none whatsoever until the time of Epiphanius, bishop of Salamis in Cyprus, in the latter half of the 4th century, a writer commendable indeed, as Dupin says, for zeal, learning, and piety, but credulous, indiscriminating, inaccurate, and whose chief work, on heresies, is decried by Moshim as full of blots and errors, through the levity and ignorance of the author, who, moreover, in his statement in that work on this very point, supposing it correctly given, and not an error of transcription in our copies, so exemplifies this ignorance as quite to justify the silent neglect of it by those writers of our Catena, vis-a-vis Jerome, Orosius, Sulpicius, and Primatius, who wrote after him. For he speaks of St. John having prophesied when in the Isle of Patmos in the days of the Emperor Claudius, a time when, as Michaelis justly observed, it does not appear from history that there was any imperial persecution of the Christian body whatsoever, and when, moreover, the probability is that the 7 apocalyptic churches, scarce one was yet in existence, and the Apostle John, moreover, in no way associated with the district. But indeed one is almost forced to suspect some strange error in the transcriber, for Epiphanius elsewhere implies John aged to have been 90 at the time of his return from Patmos, and can we suppose that he really thought John to have been 90 years old before A.D. 54, which was the latest year of the life of Claudius, or near 70 when called by Christ to be a disciple? Besides which strange theory, we are reminded by Newton and Tillich of yet another testimony to the early date of the Apocalypse. The subscription to a Syriac version of the book, written about the beginning of the 6th century, it is thus worded: the revelation which was made by God to John the Evangelist in the island of Patmos, whither he was banished by the Emperor Nero." Unquote. But of what value is this opinion, then first broached as it would appear? Or again, of what that of the commentator Arethus, promulgated still 2 or 3 centuries later, to the effect that the Apocalypse was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, an opinion contradicted indeed elsewhere in the body of his work by himself, Alike the one and the other slept unnoticed for centuries, and, if waked up by critics of a more modern age, it has only been, as Michaelis we have seen confesses, from the supposed necessity of such dates in order to uphold any other possible explanation of the apocalyptic prophecies. It is not necessary that I discuss prominently certain points of indirect and subsidiary historical evidence in favor of an early date, which these writers have also called to their aid. A sufficient notice of them will be found below, and it will appear that they all, like the direct testimony just discussed, prove weak and worthless upon examination. Nor will the only other evidence offered on their side, evidence internal in its character, and which has been urged of late years with great earnestness and some effect by Dr. Tillich and others after Sir Isaac Newton, be found at all better able to bear examination. For what is the main argument of this kind? It is founded on certain marked similarities, discoverable, as they suppose, in sundry epistles of Peter and Paul, written before Nero's death, to passages in the Apocalypse, whence they infer that the Apocalypse was written first, the epistles afterwards. Now, in a question of this kind, it is important, indeed, essential, to distinguish between cases of reference to some antecedent writing, whether direct or by means of the article of pronouns demonstrative, and those mere similarity of thought or expression of the former class of examples, adduced by these critics from the apostolic epistles. There is not one, I believe, which is not explicable as a reference to the previous prophecies of the Old Testament. As to cases of mere similarity and coincidence of thought, if we may often see much of it even in the uninspired writings, without implying imitation on the part of one or the other of the writers, how much more may we expect undersigned resemblances in inspired writings, such as are both the epistles and the book of Revelation spoken of, seeing that, though written by different human penmen, they were inspired by one and the same divine Spirit, which Spirit may just as well be supposed to have dictated an idea or brief sketch to St. Peter or to St. Paul, which was afterwards to be developed in the finished pictures of the Apocalypse of St. John, as to have spoken by those first mentioned apostles in terms or figures borrowed from the previously promulgated pictures of the Apocalypse. All this is very evident, and with it the exceeding danger of arguing, so as Newton and Tillich have done, for the chronological priority of the Apocalypse from any supposed imitations of it which they may think to trace in one and another of the apostolic epistles. But it is to Dr. Tillich himself that we owe the setting forth of the utter unsoundness and error of this their argument in the clearest light, for he has plainly shown that on this principle there must be allowed proof of reference to the Apocalypse in St. Paul's 2 epistles to the Thessalonians, proof as conclusive as any other case, which 2 epistles were, however, notoriously written before ever a Christian church was founded at Ephesus, much more before it had any episcopal angel presiding over it, such as was addressed in the first of the apocalyptic epistles by the Lord Jesus, and the same very much in regard of the first epistle to the Corinthians, which also, as we have seen, Dr. T. strongly argues to have been post-apocalyptic, seeing that it was almost certainly written before the foundation of any of the 7 Asiatic churches except that of Ephesus. So as to the primary argument of these writers, to prove an early date from internal evidence, a secondary class of arguments from internal evidence derived from the allusions that we find in the Apocalypse to the Israelite tribes of the holy city, temple, and author, as if to say, they, the Jewish city, temple, and altar, were still standing, is even yet more obviously inconclusive, for it takes for granted that those expressions are meant literally of the Old Jerusalem and Israel, not figuratively of the Christian Church, a point which not only have they not proved, but which, I am well persuaded, and we shall soon see that the persuasion expressed is not without reason, they can never prove. Yet a few words, before I conclude, on 2 or 3 corroborative points of evidence drawn from both profane history and Scripture. First, it would seem from historic report very questionable whether Nero's persecution of Christians extended far beyond the precincts of Rome itself, a circumstance which, if true, nor is it contradicted by any distinct Christian ecclesiastical record of the first 4 centuries, negatives of itself the idea of St. John having been banished in his persecution to the mines of Patmos. Secondly, they furnish no evidence that in Nero's persecution, banishment to the islands, with its unusual penal accompaniments, was one of the punishments then put in force against accused Christians. Whereas, on the other hand, we have direct profane historic testimony in proof of that particular punishment was enforced against persons accused of Christianity in the persecution by Domitian. The illustrative case of the noble senator Clemens, equally noble wife Domitia, will readily occur to the memory of the classic reader. To which let me add, third, that it appears from Tacitus that about the 6th year of Nero, or AD 60, the city of Laodicea was destroyed by an earthquake, in which earthquake, according to Eusebius, the adjacent cities of Colossus and Heliopolis were also involved. Now, as regards Laodicea itself, we read in Tacitus that before he wrote it was rebuilt, the exact time of its restoration not being specified by him, but which, according to such memorials as exist, seems to have been completed not till some 10 or 12 years after, perhaps in the reign of Vespasian, which time of the city's restoration is of course quite inconsistent with the idea of a Laodicean church existing at the epoch of Nero's persecution, much more with the state of wealth and luxury ascribed to it in the Apocalyptic epistle. On the other hand, on the hypothesis of a Domitian date to the Apocalypse, the testimony of these monumental memorials well consists with the idea of a Laodicean prosperity sketched in the epistle, while at the same time the non-restoration, according to existing monuments, of both Heliopolis and Colossae before Domitian's death quite accounts for the silence at that time in the apocalyptic letter about Colossae and Heliopolis. How rash, then, the argument from this silence for the Neronic date, even if considered only in the light of profane history. How much more rash when considered also in the light of the adverse evidence derivable from the Scriptures themselves, in which Scriptures, not to revert to what has been argued from other of St. Paul's epistles, we have in fine his second epistle to Timothy. Then the bishop of Ephesus, written according to most probable and generally received opinion, just before his death under the Neronic persecution, and which gives us not a hint of the Apostle John's being even then established in that neighborhood, or expected, or of any such new churches having been formed there, as are addressed in live out of the 7 letters to the Asiatic churches. Besides that, the state of those churches, as apocalyptic described, seems to indicate a considerable interval of time from that of their first founding. So, for example, very especially in the case of the Ephesian church, which is charged with having then left its first love. Thus, to conclude, the varied historical evidence that has been inquired into all concurs to confirm the date originally and expressly assigned by Irenaeus to the Apocalypse, as seen and written at the close of the reign of Domitian, that is, near the end of the year 95 or beginning of 96, according to the great majority hitherto of the most approved ecclesiastical historians and biblical critics, alike Roman Catholic and Protestant, French, German, and English. Writers who've had no bias on the point in question, one way or the other, from any particular cherished theory of apocalyptic interpretation. For example, Tillemont, Dupin, Bousset, Leclerc, Turretin, Spanheim, Basnage, Lampe, Mosham, Mill, Whitby, Lardner, and etc., have all alike adopted it, to whom I am happy to add the more modern names of the German ecclesiastical historian Geisler, as well as of our own church historians Burton and Waddington, also, and very learned classical chronologist Fiennes Clinton. We may, I am persuaded, depend on its correctness, with as unhesitating and implicit confidence as on the truth of almost any of the lesser facts recorded in history. The important bearing of the true apocalyptic date on apocalyptic interpretation will soon appear.